All right, yeah, as Andrew said, I'm Daniel, and I want to talk about an issue that is really neither simple nor politically simple. Wow, let me start over. Just started. Yeah, so as Andrew said, I'm Daniel, and I want to talk about climate change, which is an issue that's really neither scientifically nor politically simple. And hopefully we're all somewhat familiar with the basic idea of climate change, but I'll give a kind of quick recap to make sure we're all on the same page. So this is a map of world temperature starting in about 1850. And the areas kind of in blue here are colder than average, and you'll see also some areas in yellow that are a little bit warmer than average. And as we tick through time here, you'll kind of notice what scientists have been noticing for about the last 50 years, which is that the Earth seems to be kind of on average getting slightly warmer. And that doesn't necessarily mean that any given place or time is going to be hot or cold, but just that on average temperatures have been increasing. And as we move from this data from Earth's past into some computer models of its future, it looks like that trend is going to continue. So what's going on here? Well, this has to do with something that Andrew touched on a little bit in the last segment, which is the greenhouse effect caused by fossil fuels and carbon dioxide. So if you imagine this is the Earth's surface here, we have sunlight from the sun coming in and heating up that surface. The surface of the Earth then radiates that heat back out to space, but some of it doesn't make it back out to space. It hits those carbon dioxide molecules in the atmosphere, it gets absorbed, and it heats up the atmosphere. So this is normally a good thing, right? Because we have heat coming in, we have heat going out, and the difference between those two kind of keeps the Earth from freezing solid. But suppose we build a factory and we start pumping out additional carbon dioxide. Pretty soon, less of that heat energy is able to make it back out to space without getting absorbed by a carbon dioxide molecule, and the entire atmosphere just heats up by a few degrees. That might not seem like a whole lot necessarily in terms of everyday weather, but if you think about the absolutely colossal amount of energy that's required to heat the entire Earth by multiple degrees, you can kind of start seeing how that might have big ripple effects over the entire Earth system. So some examples of those are things like extinction and migration. A lot of species of plants and animals are very carefully adapted to live in these specific contexts and communities that they've been in for thousands of years. And as the climate starts shifting, they have to start moving around, or perhaps they would go extinct. And this can cause a lot of upheaval environmentally and just change how these landscapes function. We can also have the problem of ocean acidification. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere doesn't just increase the temperature, it also gets absorbed into the ocean water. And as a result, that makes the ocean more acidic. And that spells bad news for things like coral reefs. So in fact, scientists think that by the end of the century, there may be almost no corals left in the world, in the wild. There's also the human impacts. You could think about agriculture in particular as being particularly sensitive to climate. So if maybe areas that are currently fertile cropland, the climate shifts a little bit, it's no longer possible to grow things there, either because it's perhaps too dry or far too wet. And you can imagine how this would cause problems on the local level or political conflict as countries try to adapt to this new world order. But how do we really know all of this? And that's kind of the topic that I want to address in this segment of the talk, which is how do we study such a big and complicated issue like climate change with all of these different moving parts? And then I want to talk about what are some of the factors that can lead to misconceptions when we talk about climate change. And finally, how can you tell what is true and what is false? So let's look at this first one. And to do that, I want to take you back 65 million years ago to what I study, which is Earth's past climate. And this is when an asteroid the size of Manhattan crashed into the Yucatan Peninsula in what is now northern Mexico. And the resulting sort of nuclear winter wiped out a substantial portion of all life on Earth, including what we would now refer to as the dinosaurs. The period that followed this was this kind of warm, mild climate characterized by a lot of these little sort of furry squirrel-like creatures that started taking over for the dinosaurs. But I want to introduce you to a woman named Ellen Thomas. She is a researcher at Yale University who is one of the world's foremost experts in what are called Benthic Foraminifera, which she's holding kind of a blown-up model of there. So what in the world is a Benthic Foraminifera? Benthic foraminifera are tiny organisms that form shells. And the word benthic in this context just means that they live on the seafloor. So what's really cool about Benthic foraminifera is that as they kind of live and die and they're buried on the bottom of the seafloor, they leave behind these layers, almost like rings on a tree, that record something about what species were present at any given time, but also indicated here kind of by the color of the water in their shells, something about the composition and chemistry of the seawater that they were living in. So we can go down and drill up a core of these things and then kind of go through that layer by layer to figure out what was happening in the oceans at any given time, maybe thousands or even millions of years in the past. So it's a really powerful, interesting tool for exploring Earth's past climate. So Ellen Thomas was looking at this period of time after the extinction of the dinosaurs, and she noticed something really interesting happening right at 56 million years ago. So this is a plot of diversity of Foraminifera, and it had been pretty flat and stable right up until this point, when it suddenly dropped off. And in fact, something like half of the species of Benthic Foraminifera just went extinct. And this was really surprising because these are species that had survived that mass extinction that killed the dinosaurs. So what was the upheaval going on here? Well, people started researching this a little bit more, and they found a couple of interesting things. And the first was that right when this had happened, there had been this massive amount of carbon dioxide that was added to the atmosphere. And we're still kind of debating exactly what caused that. There's a couple of different hypotheses, and we haven't been able to definitively disprove all of them. But whatever the cause, it also coincided with the Earth suddenly getting a lot hotter. Does this sound kind of familiar? This event came to be known as the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum, or I'll just call it the PETM. And as people kind of studied this, they realized that it really was a kind of historical example of global warming that really confirmed a lot of the basic ideas that we had developed about global warming from looking at the modern system. So for instance, you add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, it did in fact make the temperature get hotter. You added carbon dioxide, it did in fact absorb into the oceans, make them more acidic, and in fact we think that was probably what killed off the Benthic Foraminifera, in addition to causing a widespread extinction of corals that took millions of years to recover. You also have patterns of extinction and migration all over the world. You know, I mentioned that a few degrees doesn't necessarily seem like a huge difference, but that's enough that over time it can convert Greenland into a rainforest complete with alligators, which we find fossils of. So that's cool. But the reason I bring up this specific story about the PETM is that I think it's a good illustration of how climate science is kind of like putting together all the pieces of a puzzle. This is one piece of research that we did in one place, but there's also all kinds of other pieces of research that are being done, and oftentimes we don't quite see the whole picture until they all get put together. So you have people who are going out and launching satellites and looking at Earth from space. So you have people who are running elaborate computer simulations on supercomputers that try to figure out how ocean circulation might change. You have people who are going out and tranquilizing polar bears from helicopters to measure their population dynamics, which I want that job. You also have people like amateur bird watchers who go out and keep track of what bird species are present in each given area and look at how that changes over time. So all of these kind of pieces of the puzzle come together to produce a bigger picture of how the world is responding to something like climate change. But how do we go from that kind of individual pieces in practice to a bigger picture? So I want to talk about what's called the scientific publishing cycle. And if you remember this thing from Jace's talk, talking about the scientific method, what happens when we get down to the last bit and we want to share our results? So suppose a scientist does an experiment, they collect some data, they have their results, and they want to share this. They'll write it into a paper, which will basically just say, here's what we did, here's what it seems to show, here's where this stands in relation to all of the other research that's been done thus far. And they'll submit that paper to a journal. So there's a lot of different scientific journals, and some of them are more reputable than others, but if it's a good journal, they'll do what's called peer review, which is where they send this to some other scientists that work in perhaps a very similar field, and they'll say, is this well done? Is it worth publishing? And this kind of three-way conversation will ensue where they hash out exactly what is going to be in this paper, and once they're happy with it, it gets published. And this is where scientists can then read this paper, discuss it, talk about it, and oftentimes this will give them new ideas and lead them back around the circle to generate new experiments in their own data, and the cycle will repeat. So periodically someone will go through and they'll take all of these individual papers and write what we call a review article that summarizes, here's what's been done, here's what it seems to mean, here's the parts that we still need to do. So in climate science, the kind of granddaddy of all review articles is something that we call the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is a periodic report that's compiled by thousands of different scientists for the United Nations. And it's intended to kind of represent this consensus position where, there's lots of little details we're still fiddling with. Maybe not everybody quite agrees on this yet, but this is the basic stuff that we all can more or less agree on. So about 120 different nations have to sign off on the basic conclusions of this report. And obviously there's a lot of stuff in here, not to mention the political complications that come with something like that. But I think the main question that people really want to know is, how do scientists actually agree on that basic question of whether global warming is happening? So the answer is yes, and I kind of want to show you this. And the main main thing I want you to take away from this plot is that here's a variety of different surveys that have been done over the years from different groups of people. Basically, as one's expertise in climate science increases up to the people who maybe study this professionally and would be most expected to sort of know what they're talking about, your likelihood of believing in climate change goes up until really among the people who study this professionally, maybe only about 1 out of 100 would actually deny that basic conclusion, which, as a scientist, I'd say that's pretty much as close to consensus as you're ever going to get. We like to disagree with each other. But how do we go from this kind of nice puzzle pieces coming together to generate this picture we can more or less all agree upon to this, people debating on TV about whether the whole thing is just a hoax? So I kind of want to talk about this second topic, which is what are some of the factors that can lead to misconceptions when we talk about climate science in the media? And I want to talk about 3. So the first is something that I would call soundbite syndrome. Climate science is really complicated. And that means that when we talk about it, we kind of have to digest it down into these small sound bites that are easier to understand on an everyday level. And sometimes that can cause problems, because it's kind of hard to evaluate whether they're true or not. So to give you an example to kind of walk you through how this might work, and also give you an excuse to talk about some cool climate science, this is a quote from former presidential candidate Mike Huckabee talking about climate change. He says, "Humans probably do influence climate, but a volcano in one blast will contribute more than 100 years of human activity." So this kind of sounds reasonable at first glance. If you're not an expert, you might not really know how to evaluate whether that's true, and it's certainly not a new idea. Ronald Reagan said something very similar back in the 80s, and it's exactly the kind of thing you can imagine someone hearing on the radio and then bringing up at Thanksgiving dinner. But is it actually true? Well, the short answer is no. If you just think as a broad schematic, this is the human release of carbon dioxide every year. The amount that volcanoes add to that it's like 0.5% of that. So it's clearly not a huge influence. But I think this raises much more broadly this more interesting question of how do we actually know that humans are the ones releasing all this carbon dioxide? So this is a plot of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere starting about 1,000 years ago, and we've compiled this from sort of ice core records and things like that. And you'll notice that it's pretty flat and stable right up until you get to maybe a little bit before 1800. So what happens a little bit before 1800? The Industrial Revolution. Humans start burning a lot more fossil fuels, they start releasing a lot more carbon dioxide, and that's right when we see this starting to climb. So the timing of it matches up. But let's not stop there. The amount of it also matches up. It's a little bit hard to estimate like how much coal people were burning in 1850, but here's sort of one estimate of fossil fuel use over time. And if you calculate from this how much carbon dioxide we would expect to be released, the number matches up pretty much exactly. Well, again, let's not stop there. The composition of it also matches up. This is a little bit hard to explain. It kind of has to do with how carbon dioxide from different sources, the molecules actually weigh a slightly different amount, but you could think of it a little bit like maybe mixing colors. So if natural carbon dioxide is this kind of heavier sort of blue color, so to speak, and carbon dioxide from oil and petroleum products is this kind of red color. If we add more of that carbon dioxide, we would expect the overall composition of the atmosphere to sort of turn a little bit purple, which is in fact exactly what we've seen happen over the last 1,000 years. So the timing of this matches up, the amount of it matches up, the composition of it matches up. I think we can pretty definitively say this little soundbite about volcanoes is busted. But notice kind of what I just did there. I just responded to one soundbite by giving you another soundbite, which was hopefully a little bit better informed. But if you really wanted to understand all of the detail and depth of this issue, you kind of would have to spend a lot of time reading a bunch of papers like this, which uses the phrase basin-wide disequilibrium just in the introduction. And to borrow the saying, ain't nobody got time for that. So this is maybe kind of an unsolvable problem, but I think to me it really emphasizes how important it is to find good sources, because you can find a lot of people saying a lot of things, but you want to find the people who are saying the right things. So it takes some effort to track them down. The second difficulty that this gives rise to is kind of touching on this idea of camps and tribes that Andrew talked about. Because we are kind of forced to talk about climate change in terms of these little sound bites, your opinion about climate change is often much more determined by what sound bites you've been exposed to than by what the actual science is. So where you grew up, what kind of people you talk to, what kind of TV shows you watch. And we see this reflected in the sort of political climate, where this is a map showing that parts of the country where people are less likely to believe that climate change is real versus parts of the country maybe where they're more likely to believe that it's real. And once you develop these opinions, you have your friends, you've had your discussions, it kind of becomes a part of your identity, sort of like your political orientation, and it can kind of feel like an attack when someone comes at you with a different approach. And I think this is probably one of the big reasons why this is such a divisive issue, is because it becomes personal. The third difficulty that I think often happens is what I would call the controversy. How many times have you seen something like this? We have two people, two talking heads on TV. One of them believes in climate change, the other one maybe doesn't, and they're sort of hashing it out. And this kind of presents the impression that there's this raging 50-50 debate going on about whether climate change is actually real. And of course, what we saw earlier is that's really not the case among the people who study this professionally. They know what the data say. But because the media is always looking for this kind of, let's find the other side to give some balance to our presentation, it kind of creates the impression that there's more controversy than there really is. So in light of this, how can we tell what is true and what is false? So I want to present kind of three ideas here that I think sort of summarize some of the points that have been presented in the previous few talks. And the first is just to beware of lone voices. It's very tempting to kind of be like, yeah, the one maverick guy figured it out, sticking it to the man. But oftentimes there's a reason why there's only one of them. If you remember Andrew Wakefield, who Jason brought up originally, he was kind of this maverick scientist going against the whole scientific establishment. And the reason that nobody believed him was because he was wrong. So you always have to keep in mind, what is the bigger picture here? Can you use the scientific method, try to disprove some of these ideas that are floating around and see which ones actually stand up? The second thing is to beware of these tribes and camps. Remember Andrew's example of doing this kind of nuanced scientific study that then got attacked from both sides because each side was kind of more interested in their own agenda and perspective than they were really on what the scientific facts were. So you always have to be thinking, is this source that I'm reading biased by like their group identity? Is this just what they believe? Are they really presenting all sides of this issue, or are they just presenting one of them? Or perhaps much more importantly and harder to do, we always have to be thinking, am I biased by what I think is probably true? Because if I am, I need to maybe take a step back and reassess that and find some alternative views. The third thing, which I hope you get out of this last presentation, is just the importance of looking for good sources. You can find a lot of people saying a lot of different things. So the really important question is, what do most scientists actually think about this? Because the people who actually study this are probably the most likely to be correct. And looking for things like review articles is a really good way of doing that. But I want to kind of end these presentations by talking maybe about a slightly more positive spin on the idea of science in the media. So this is Netarts Bay in Oregon, and it's home of the Whiskey Creek shellfish hatchery, which grows oysters. And about 10 years ago, this hatchery realized that they were having a problem where all of their baby oysters were dying and they couldn't figure out why. So they enlisted the help of a team of scientists who went through and figured out that the result was, or the cause of this had to do with something we talked about earlier, which is ocean acidification. The water was getting more acidic and the baby oysters just couldn't form their shells properly in the young stages of their life. So because they were able to figure out that this is what was going on, they were able to install some equipment that basically carefully monitored and made sure that the chemistry of the water didn't change, and pretty soon the shellfish hatchery was once again booming. But what I think is really interesting about this story is what happened after that. Because the media picked up this story and started running with it as an example of how humans have been able to adapt to some of the effects of climate change. And pretty soon, this fishery, or this hatchery, was getting calls from all over the world from people saying, hey, we're having the same problem. Can you show us what you did so we can fix it for ourselves? And as a result, this kind of partnership of media and hatcheries and scientists were able to really be a benefit to the entire world. So I think this is a good example of how scientists, business people, and the media really all have important things to offer. When they work together, instead of just having fights over their own perspectives, we can really make the world a better place. So hopefully these talks have given you some ideas about how to interpret things in science and in the media. And the next time you're kind of scrolling down your Facebook feed, you'll be better equipped to evaluate some of the things that are being said. If you're interested in more talks like this, you can check out the Detector Detectives, another group from Science in the News who talked about the science of light and particles. It's pretty lit. You should check it out. Thank you.